Welcome to your second PowerPoint module for this course. This week we're going to be zooming in a bit more on socioeconomic inequality and mobility. We've already had some conversations about this, but here we're going to get into some more detail and really break down the different theoretical perspectives that discuss or address socioeconomic inequality. And here are our objectives for this week. The first is to introduce theoretical perspectives related to socioeconomic inequality. We're going to primarily focus on functionalism this week, and we're going to start to get into conflict theory, but really get into that in more detail next week. These words make no sense to you right now, that is okay. And then second, we're going to evaluate the strengths, limitations, and assumptions of functionalist arguments of inequality. And that is really what was the basis for the two readings that you did for this week. And finally, here are your deliverables for this week. What do you need to turn in on Inquire? As usual, you have your reading question due Monday night. You have your PowerPoint module, which you're doing right now, due Tuesday night. And this week you only have 3 questions to respond to. Last week you had 4. And you have no assignments due this Friday the 4th. So it's just the reading question, the PowerPoint module, and joining your Zoom session. I also want to announce one important change to upcoming due dates. So initially you had your first film analysis due next Friday, but I want to give you more time to really work with the economic inequality readings, and I want to have a chance to really go over and discuss the readings for next week well in advance of you having to complete the film analysis. So I decided to push it a week. Now your film analysis, your first one, is due on Friday, September 18th, not for a couple weeks. Because you had a take-home exam due on the 18th, and I didn't want to give you 2 major assignments due the same day, I pushed that a week as well. So now your first take-home exam is due on September 25th. There are a few reasons for this, like I just said. I want you to have a little bit more time with the economic inequality readings. I want to have more time in class to cover those before you start on your film analysis. The other reason is because now some of you might be moving on campus on the 11th and 12th, so I wanted to give you a bit more time with this. These are the only 2 deadline changes at this point. All right, so let's get started with your opening question. And once I read the prompt, if you need to hear it, you can pause the module where you are, go to Inquire, answer the question, and then come back after. Here's your question. Why do you think that school principals are paid more than teachers on average? Why do you think teachers are paid more than bus drivers on average? What would Davis and Moore say about these pay inequalities? And what would Tooman say about them? So those are your 2 readings, remember? You do not need to give an in-depth analysis of both of the readings, but give me some sense of what you think these authors would say about the existence of pay inequality between principals, teachers, and bus drivers. Okay, so you can pause here, go on to Inquire, answer the question, and come back when you're done. Before we get into the meat of those 2 readings you did, the Davis and Moore and the Tooman readings, I want to go over a few terms that are very relevant to our discussion of socioeconomic inequality and mobility. First, what is socioeconomic status? This is a word or a couple words that are thrown around a lot. We use socioeconomic status, or SES for short, a lot in discussion, and we will use it a lot in this class. So what do we mean? How is SES measured as well? So classic measures of socioeconomic status are income, education, and occupation. Those are the big 3 measures that are typically used in research and also typically used in discussion of SES when we are discussing economic inequality. There are other common measures. So perhaps instead of looking at income, which is just how much money you make, the paycheck that you take home, we might talk about wealth. Wealth goes beyond income. Wealth is about owned property or other assets, such as stocks or bonds, owning a home, owning a car. This all contributes to your wealth, goes beyond income. We might also look at neighborhood level income. We might look at poverty or one's, being above or below the poverty line as a measure of SES. But these are the basic ways in which we measure it. Second, what is socioeconomic inequality? This is probably pretty straightforward, but if we're looking at maybe the US as a whole, we'd be looking at the gap in income and wealth within a country. So the gap between maybe the top 20% of earners and the bottom 20% of earners. Finally, what is economic mobility? Mobility is about the movement of individuals or families up or down in income and wealth. This is about movement, maybe within one generation, or looking at the mobility of an individual. Maybe we're looking at mobility across generations. So looking at where children end up once they reach adulthood compared to where their parents were economically. We're going to use these terms a lot throughout the semester. So I wanted to be clear on what these were and gave you a bit about how they're often measured. Now let's talk a bit about the theoretical perspectives that emerged in your readings for this week. And they weren't explicitly called theoretical perspectives. They weren't even explicitly named, but there are a couple of perspectives that we are going to talk about and we're going to name as a class. The first perspective, and this is the one that we're going to focus on for the most part this week, is called functionalism, or a functionalist perspective. And it really is what it sounds like. Functionalism argues that socioeconomic inequality is inevitable and necessary for a stable society. So we need inequality for society to function. Functionalism. This is the core argument that Davis and Moore are making, that first article. In addition, they argued that we need different rewards or different incomes for different positions in society. And that is going to motivate people to attain higher positions. So we talked about that a bit last week in class as well. Finally, a limited number of people have the inherent talent to work high status positions. So where one ends up, socioeconomically, in terms of income and wealth, is really based on their inherent talent and their hard work. Sounds familiar, right? So these are the core tenets of the functionalist perspective for social inequality, and particularly economic inequality. This is the position that Davis and Moore are making in that first reading for this week. Now we're going to get into what Tumin has to say about that. Now the Tumin article, this is the second one that you read. I hope you read them in that order. Tumin's got a lot to say about the assumptions or the perspectives that Davis and Moore bring into their article, right? He's got a bit of attitude about it, or as much attitude as someone can have when they're writing a journal article. What does Tumin say in response to Davis and Moore? And there's a lot more than what I have on this slide in that article, but I want to go through at least a few of these rhetorical questions that Tumin might pose to Davis and Moore based on the reading. First, how do we decide which positions are functionally important compared to others? Right? So how do we make that value judgment that a principal should get paid more than a teacher, for example? I'm not going to answer these because I want you to do more of that in class this week. But here are the kinds of rhetorical questions that Tumin would ask. The second, how do we determine the amount of talent in a given society? And furthermore, doesn't having rigid inequality within a society stifle talent among those who are at the bottom? Do we have a lot of unrecognized talent because there aren't as many opportunities to really enact or realize that talent for those who are at the bottom? Another question. Tumin also asks, what are people actually sacrificing as they receive training in order to ultimately get to a higher status position? So to step back, Davis and Moore argue that some people should be paid more because they put more time, they put more work, and they put more money into receiving training or an education in order to get to this position. And we'll talk about whether or not this is accurate in our class this week, because I think this is one we could say, well, education is actually pretty expensive, right? So we'll talk more about that one later. Fourth question Tumen might pose: is money really the only source of motivation? Are there other sources of motivation that might be really more fair to impose in a stratified system compared instead of income? We'll talk more about that in class as well. And then finally here, is it really inevitable that the unequal distribution of power and property also leads to the unequal distribution of prestige and esteem? And that's really talking more to assuming the moral character of a person, or really where they stand socially based on how much property they own or how much power they have. We'll talk about that one as well in class. But I just wanted to give you a few points related to Tumen's response to Davis and Moore, or the challenges that he poses to Davis and Moore. Now for your video question. I posted a PBS NewsHour clip on Inquire titled, "How the Upper Middle Class Keeps Everyone Else Out." This link is on Inquire. I want you to answer the following video question after you watch. How does the discussion of economic inequalities in the video clip relate to the arguments posed by Davis and Moore and or by Tumen? So you don't have to address both of them if you don't think that one is really addressed well in the video clip, or you could address both of the readings. Perhaps you might want to focus on if there are any assumptions of why inequalities exist within the video, and then also, what are the structural factors that are shaping the existence of these inequalities? That may relate a bit more to Tumen. So I put this slide here as more of a preview for what you're going to be doing next week, but I want to introduce this now because we do see a bit of conflict theory in the Tumen reading. We're going to see a whole lot more of it next week. But besides the functionalist perspective, which is where we started with this PowerPoint module, and which is really represented in the Davis and Moore reading, we might think of socioeconomic inequality through the lens of conflict theory. Here's a brief summary of what conflict theory is about. We're going to talk a lot more about this next week. Conflict theory states that economic power struggles are an inevitable part of a capitalist society. So in that way, it's a little bit similar to functionalism and talking about these economic power struggles being inevitable, at least within a capitalist society. Second point, the wealthy exploit those with fewer resources to maintain power and status. And I've seen this a little bit in the video that you just watched. So conflict theory is fundamentally about exploitation. And then finally, power struggles lead to social change through competition and upheaval. So out of conflict comes change. This is a very brief overview of conflict theory. There are a lot of different branches of conflict theory, a lot of different ways that we could talk about it. But what I want you to see here at this point is functionalism is one perspective. Tumen had a lot of issues with the functionalist perspective presented by Davis and Moore. And Tumen also is really starting to introduce conflict theory for us. And we're going to get into other readings next week that explicitly touch on conflict theory. The closing question for this week is actually pretty broad and just really a way for me to gauge where you are in understanding or thinking about this material. So when you're ready, you can pause and answer the following closing question on Inquire. What is one thing that you learned from the readings or the PowerPoint module this week? What is one term, concept, or issue from the readings or the module that remains unclear to you? And it is perfectly okay, and I expect that some things are going to remain unclear, especially from the readings for this week. right? So you can post your closing question now and then come back for the last slide about class this week. All right, so for class this week, we're going to have the same format as we had the week before. Group A is coming in on Zoom on Wednesday, Group B on Zoom on Friday. And in class, we're going to review arguments made in each of the readings. We're going to get into more depth than the kind of bare bones overview that I gave here. And then we're going to consider implications for policy and social reforms, because I'm already seeing that your reading questions are more about, what do we do given socioeconomic inequality and given the causes of this inequality. Okay, so come ready to discuss, and I will see you in class on Zoom.